G'day, and welcome to ComicsMATE, your mates in comics from the land down under. I'm Dean James, and today we're going to be talking about the inevitable death of the American comic book industry, as DC has just released their sales numbers showing that the problems are far worse than any of us thought. Considering the state of mainstream American comics, this probably won't come as a surprise to most of you, but if DC is doing this poorly, we can only assume Marvel Comics are doing just as bad, because they have elected to keep their numbers private. But before I jump into this article from Fandom Pulse, please hit the like button to help push this video out into the algorithm, and subscribe so you don't miss any of my future videos. Now let's do this. Comic industry rattled as DC Comics posts disastrous sales with a 25% drop in 1 year, and lowest numbers to bookstores since 2004. That's actually crazy, especially since the quote-unquote professionals in the mainstream comic industry assure me that everything is fine. Maybe telling everyone not to buy your books wasn't such a good idea.
And if you don't like my politics, don't buy my book.
The last several months have woken many up to the comic book industry's problems. Retailer Glenn O'Leary blew the doors off of the problems in mainstream comic book content and their self-insert characters, which was roundly mocked by industry professionals who felt threatened and identified with his statement. This is the guy that called Glenn a salami-breathed hog. Glass houses, Ramon. Glass houses.
Most of these new writers don't have the love of comics like these older writers had. And all they care about is, how can I put myself in the book? No, we don't care what you would do if you were Iron Man. We don't care who you are. You're writing Tony Stark. You're not writing yourself in a book. If that's the case, write your own comic with you in it. No one will read it because nobody cares. People grew up, are growing up loving Peter Parker, loving Miles Morales, loving all these Captain America. We don't need you to put your input in it. Just write Steve Rogers. Don't write Steve Rogers. What would Steve Rogers be if I was Steve Rogers? That's not how it works. But that's again how most of these new people write nowadays. That's why most of the stuff is shit. Because we don't care what you would do, because we don't care about your life whatsoever. Just write a book, get paid for what you do, get paid for what you're supposed to be doing, and make it a good story.
This was followed up by journalist Heidi MacDonald, laying out figures that Marvel and DC Comics were in trouble. Now, buried in another article, it appears DC Comics is in even worse of a position than we've suspected. I'd be willing to bet that Marvel Comics is in the very same boat as DC, but they are still yet to release any official numbers. The writing's been on the wall for some time. Comic book retailers are closing shops regularly. It's actually tragic how many stores are closing on a regular basis. Simply Google comic book store closing and see for yourself. Or you can watch this video where I go over the entire thing and explain why this is happening at a time when comic book characters are at the height of their popularity. Marvel and DC Comics made moves to not even report their sales any longer. All the while, the gatekeepers of the comic book industry keep posting that there was nothing wrong and that sales were fine. More than fine, actually. They still, to this day, will try to tell you that if you don't like the direction they're going, you're the problem. You are obviously just a bigot or some kind of ist or phobe, depending on your complaint. But there's no denying the problems the industry is facing. This regressive nonsense has been going on for far too long at this point, and obviously can't keep sustaining itself with likes on social media or virtue signal brownie points. We've seen reports that IDW Publishing has laid off more than 40% of its staff in the last year, showing signs of wear for the second string of mainstream comics, as the heavily licensed publisher under Heather Antos has circled the wagons around diversity hiring at the expense of their content quality. Heather Antos must have some serious dirt on whoever is in charge at IDW, because she has been nothing but a problem for every publisher she has ever worked for. When she's not simply being an absolute embarrassment of an editor by allowing spelling mistakes in even the title of her book slip through to print, she is arguing with fans on Twitter. But that's okay, because she is part of the comic book whisper network that have bullied and harassed countless out of the industry, even recently contributing to the death of comic book artist Ed Piskor. Some of them were actually named in his final words that he left in a note. Meanwhile, smaller publishers like Aftershock and Scout Comics were outed as not even paying their creatives. I'm sure I don't need to explain why not paying your writers and artists is a bad thing, right? How does this impact DC Comics? In a recent interview, Batman writer Chip Zdarsky finally blew the doors off the comic book industry collapse. He admitted massive issues were going on with the mainstream industry, saying, "The problems in comics are a myriad right now. There are so many ways that the industry is being harmed and is having trouble kind of recovering. it's facing challenges. While he did elaborate as to sales after talking with several retailers, reading between the lines of Heidi MacDonald's shill coverage, one finds that sales have been on a steady decline since the pandemic, as comic readers have mostly gotten out of the habit of reading these books from Marvel and DC. This has been going on far longer than since the pandemic. Comics have been infected with these dogmatic lunatics since at least 2012, and sales have been steadily declining since 2016. But the narcissist professionals at Marvel and DC love to blame anything other than their own failings, and until they admit the actual problems, it's only going to get worse. To prove this, one just has to look at manga and indie comics, who have been thriving during all of this. It's not that people have lost interest in comics as a medium, it's that they've lost interest in mainstream creators constantly insulting them while releasing subpar products. Whether it's the poor quality of the artwork at Marvel and DC, the uninspired or downright terrible and boring stories, the political gaslighting, the constant focus on LGBT propaganda, or the constant insulting of fans on social media. Here's one of the most recent examples. This is Tim Sheridan, the man who retconned the Alan Scott Green Lantern into a gay man. And when people who have been a fan of this character for decades asked questions like, what about his wife and kid, this is how he responded.
But already the haters and the queerphobes are out in force, doing everything they can to see that this book tanks. They use code and they make it sound like they have legit problems with a book they haven't read yet. But the truth is, they just don't like that there's a queer hero in the upper ranks of the DCEU. If you think comics are and should continue to be for everyone, or if you just want to force these ComicsGate trolls back under the bridge they crawled out from, we outnumber them. So let's pool our power, vote with our wallets, and beat these assholes.
Caring about a character's established history, including their family, doesn't make somebody a homophobe, comicsgate, or an asshole, Tim. But sadly, this is pretty standard when it comes to the mainstream comic industry and how they treat their customers. None of these things have anything to do with the pandemic, and most fans are fed up with it. DC Comics has suffered worse than Marvel. With their Dawn of DC relaunch failing to garner much interest, fans seem tired of having to completely reboot the DC universe every few years. From New 52 to Rebirth, a third relaunch in just over a decade seemed like a good jumping off point. Once DC Comics made changes to Superman, Robin, Hawkgirl, Green Lantern, and more to add homosexual virtue signaling, few wanted to continue with the lines. It's been a running joke in the industry that Batman is the only thing DC Comics can even sell anymore. This article is only a few days old, and DC have already announced another brand new reboot/new universe called Absolute. This just tells me that they've learned nothing and obviously aren't listening to whatever fans they have left. And with Batman, even those sales have been dropping since the New 52, recently being outsold by Ultimate Spider-Man at Marvel, which was a milestone for the company and the first time something like that had happened in a long time. That's not even including manga, which if we do, we can see that a single series, Demon Slayer, outsold the entire mainstream comic book industry on its own just last year. DC and American comic books as a whole have a serious problem that they can't deny anymore. Sales figures have been confirmed to be in a state of decline. Again, in a ComicsMATE expose on the industry, Brian Hibbs released an annual report from Bookscan, highlighting sales in the industry to regular bookstores. While we still don't have the accurate numbers for comic shops, this gives a bellwether as to where the industry is going. It's going to shit, that's where it's going. In this expose, Hibbs writes that Marvel and DC Comics represent less than 10% of comic book sales, a shockingly low number for what many call the Big Two. Less than 10%? That's worse than I would have guessed, to be honest. It's probably time we stop calling them the Big Two, because that's obviously not the case anymore. However, it gets worse for DC Comics. As he writes, DC had a pretty bad year, with their lowest sales since 2004, down 25% from 2022 in the bookstore market. Even with their highest ever number of titles in the total list, in 2023, they had only 14 titles in the top 750. In 2013, 10 years ago, they had 130. That is a huge and troubling drop. But maybe laying off nearly your entire sales and marketing team is not a great strategy for growth. If someone had been making a concerted effort to dismantle DC Comics, they couldn't have been more surgical. Luckily, DC still has talented execs like Mari Javins, Jim Lee, Annie DePies, and the rest of the staff who have thwarted those plans. And from what we're hearing, 2024 will see some more moves to reverse this concerning trend. I honestly hope so. Despite what this video may suggest, I genuinely love comic books and always have. Specifically Marvel and DC comic books. So the last thing I want is for them to go out of business, but that's honestly the direction they're headed. Many people have theorized that if they don't make a change soon, Marvel and DC will end up being only in the movies and television, with the comics completely dying off. And I don't think any fan, whether old or new, wants that to happen. Amazingly, ComicsMATE writers can still spin this as, and that's a good thing, as many mainstream articles try to mitigate the destruction of entertainment industries like comics at the hands of the woke. ComicsMATE used to be a great website for news surrounding the comic book industry, but over the years they have become little more than a shill website. As with most comic book publications these days, they are either involved with or victims of the Whisper network, and only report on the approved news stories, ignoring things like Ethan Van Sciver's Cyberfrog or Eric July's record-breaking sales of Isom because they are on the wrong side. Personally, I don't care what side you're on, as long as you focus on making your comic entertaining. DC Comics is on a death spiral, and unless they make wholesale changes to prioritize story and less identity politics virtue signaling at the hands of creators like Tom King or Tom Taylor, we can expect this sales decline will continue. The virtue signaling of Tom Taylor has effectively destroyed his career. He spent months calling all of the fans homophobic over his gay Superman in a weird attempt to garner the affections of the woke Twitter mob. But that has since blown up in his face, as you can see here. There are many of them now burning photos of him because he isn't woke enough. Somebody's going to have to remind me again how these people aren't mentally unstable and prone to violence. Too bad for you, Tom. You've made your bed and now you're going to have to lie in it. They hate you now, and normal people on this side of the aisle won't be supporting you either. And Tom King is just a weird loser with mummy issues, so there's no way he will ever dig himself out of the hole he has dug for himself. Good riddance to both of them. But that's all I have for you today. My name's Dean James, your mate in comics from the land down under. If you haven't already, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys again next time.